What should we expect for the global economy in 2025? In this video, we look at the broad themes for the year ahead, and these are the ones that bear watching closely. We also look at what's expected to be good, bad, and downright ugly. And we'll wrap up with my expectations for 2025. Don't forget, if you do enjoy our content, like this video and subscribe to our channel. Let's begin with the broad themes for 2025. And I'd like to focus on three of these themes. The first one is the source of greatest uncertainty, and that's to do with a potential trade war. The reason why there's potentially going to be a trade war is because Trump is the tariff man. He said he's going to introduce tariffs. They could be very widespread or they could be quite focused. We really don't know which way he's going to go with that policy. But depending on the severity and the scope of those tariffs, and also critically the counter tariffs from countries which have been affected, then we could see massive shifts in the global economy, both for the US and with its trading partners. The second point is that if we look at which countries are forecast to do well in terms of GDP growth, there's a very clear divergence between, for example, the US, which is expected to do very well indeed, and in emerging markets we turn to India, which is expected to do very well. And then at the other end of the spectrum, GDP growth in Europe is expected to be weak. Again, that depends very much on the first point, which is the trade war. And also China's growth is expected to be relatively weak. So that's the very broad brush picture. Now we'll dig into some of the details and we'll organize it by how bad things are going to get. And we'll start off with what's good, because it's certainly not the case that 2025 is going to be an utter disaster. Far from it. Now the IMF produces a global growth forecast, and here it is for global GDP for the 6 years ahead. Now I've highlighted the forecast region with that red rectangle. Now going back to 1980, you can see that the median growth rate for the global economy is something like 3.3%, and I've highlighted that with a dashed yellow line. And if we focus on that 6 year ahead forecast, you can see that it's not much below that median growth rate. So it's certainly not the case that we're going to see a huge slowdown in growth or even something as severe as a global recession. It's pretty much what we've already seen in this post-pandemic period. Now, if we break that down by region, you can see in 2025, the expectation is 1.8% growth, the same as 24. And similarly in emerging markets, a fairly lackluster 4.2%, which is what we got in 24. However, if we drill into the differences between countries, there we start to see some divergences. So here what you can see are the actual levels of GDP coming up to 2024. So the forecast region is after the dashed yellow line to the right of the graph. And again, it's this 6 year outlook which the IMF produces. Now, if we focus on the bottom of the graph, those are the advanced countries. You can see that there is a divergence there, and the US is pretty much at the top of the pack. The UK and France are in the middle of the pack. And the real disappointment, I'd say, is Germany, which used to be the industrial powerhouse of Europe, but it's really fallen into a bad way due to some terrible policy decisions in the past. Then if we shift our focus to the top of the graph and we look at developing countries, you can see that India is expected to far outstrip China in fairly short order. And again, this is because of policy mistakes which have been made in the past in China, and it's really looking quite good for India. Of course, a lot of that's already priced into its equity market, but still, it definitely diverges from China according to this forecast. So the overall macro picture is a positive one, I'd say, with inflation falling across much of the developed world and in emerging markets as well. Services inflation is still quite sticky, but if we look at goods, those have often gone into deflation, and we're seeing broad-based return to normal inflation. The second point, which is great if you're just a normal person, is that your wages are probably growing faster than inflation. So in real terms, you're getting more wealthy as time goes on. Now that's not sustainable in the sense that central banks will try and turn things around such that wage growth will be roughly in line with inflation, maybe slightly higher, because remember that is itself inflationary. But certainly for now, I'd say that's a positive because it means greater household income and greater potential to spend, which is good for growth. The third point, which is also positive, I think, is that interest rates are now falling and they're going to a new higher level, but still nothing like as high as they were during the peak of inflation when central banks were really battling hard to get inflation down to normal levels. So if we dig into those rate expectations, and this is the forecast from Goldman Sachs for 2025, you can see that they expect interest rates set by the Federal Reserve in the US, the Bank of England in the UK, and the ECB in the euro area to gradually come back down to around 3% for the US and the UK, and for the euro area slightly lower at just under 2% policy rate. So disinflation leads to lower rates and a less restrictive policy rate. Now, in smaller developed markets, we're seeing unemployment increase more rapidly and disinflation kick in more rapidly than we did in those other regions. So there we'd expect policy rates to be cut faster. So that's for countries like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Sweden, and Switzerland. So that's the good bit, a fairly positive macroeconomic backdrop and rates returning to normal and inflation returning to normal. Now let's turn to the stuff which is bad. Now again, this is the outlook from Goldman Sachs and it's their expectations for inflation. And specifically, they're looking at 3 scenarios based on what happens with tariffs. The central case you can see in blue, and that is continued disinflation. In other words, the rate of inflation gradually falls such that by the beginning of 2027 it's back down to 2%. This is for the US, of course. Now, the assumptions that go into that are based on 20 percentage points increase in tariffs for China. And at the same time, there are fairly targeted tariffs on automobile imports from the EU and Mexico. No mention of counter tariffs here, notice. And the most extreme scenario that Goldman considers is one in which you get 10% across the board tariffs. And that's the line which you can see which spikes at about 3% inflation, and that occurs around the middle of 2026. Then it gradually falls back down to 2%, which is the Fed's target, by the time we get to the summer of 27. So really it's a matter of delaying the disinflation process, which we're seeing already, even in the most extreme case of across-the-board tariffs. Now that's going to come with a cost to US industries which are dependent on imports, and it's going to come at a cost to US consumers who'll probably end up paying more for products which are imported or depend on imports. But because inflation is based on year-on-year changes, once those year-on-year changes drop out of the comparison window, then the one-off increase in prices gradually diminishes. That doesn't mean prices go back to where they were, they just stay at their new higher level. Now at the moment, it has to be said, we don't know what those tariffs are going to be, so this makes forecasting very difficult. You really can't do anything other than produce these scenarios. Now we saw that the global growth expectations from the IMF are still pretty good for the 6 years ahead, but we did see divergences between different countries. And what I've done here is to highlight the countries which are below their regional average. So for example, if we look at Germany, France, Italy, but also Japan and the UK, you can see that those are all below their regional average. That's particularly disappointing for the UK, where the new Labour government came in with promises of greater growth, but frankly it doesn't look as if that's been factored into the IMF forecasts because they just don't believe it's going to happen. This forecast was created in October based on analysis done before then, so maybe it's because they haven't factored everything in, but still, the expectations there are not great. Germany is another disappointment. It used to be the powerhouse of Europe, but again, policy decisions which they've made based on energy, getting rid of their nuclear power, being really dependent on Russian gas, which was affected by sanctions, and of course being late to the game with electrification of vehicles, all of that has really worked against Germany, and it doesn't seem as if it's got its policies into place to cope with those headwinds. And of course that's reflected in the growth forecast. And then turning to emerging markets, you can see that Russian growth, because of sanctions and its war with Ukraine, that's expected to be a very weak 1.2% in 2025. Now, the effect of tariffs on China, although bad, I think are not catastrophic. That's why this didn't go into the ugly category. To see why that's the case, let's imagine a really extreme scenario where all Chinese exports to the US were written down to zero. What effect would that roughly have on Chinese GDP? Well, Chinese GDP is about 130 trillion renminbi, and about 20% of that comes from exports. And of that 20%, 15% of the exports are to the US. Multiply those two numbers together, 20% and 15%, and you end up with about 3 percentage points of GDP growth being wiped off if no exports were sent to the US at all. That's a total of 4 trillion yuan, which sounds like a lot, but it is just a rounding error for Chinese GDP. Now, there are lots of secondary effects based on investment and also business confidence, consumer confidence, but certainly in terms of direct exposure to exports and its effect on GDP, I think that'll be fairly limited. Now, that's not good news by any means, but it's not catastrophic. Now, if you want to keep up with what's going on in economics, but also markets and how the two interact, a great way to do that is by signing up to our free weekly market roundup. This is sent into your inbox every Friday as soon as we finish it. It's got a lot of humor interspersed with the really good nuggets of information. And to give you a taste of the high quality analysis which we do in there, you can see here quality street sweets compared with EM countries. So for example, India is the green triangle, China's the unique and divisive strawberry delight, and then the highly correlated commodity producers would be the sticky stuff, toffee finger, caramel swirl, toffee penny, and fudge. So if you are interested in signing up for that, it's completely free and we won't spam you with lots of salesy stuff. Just go to our website pensioncraft.com/newsletter to learn more. Now let's turn to the economic expectations, which are truly ugly. Now Goldman's done something pretty cool, which is to look at trade policy uncertainty and its effect on GDP. And this is based on what happened with tariffs in 2018 and 2019 with the previous Trump presidency. Now trade policy uncertainty has certainly been weighing on US growth. So what Goldman have said is, what would happen if we've got the same peak of uncertainty as we got in 2018 and 2019, looking forward to GDP growth in the years ahead? What they expect for the US is wiping about 0.3 percentage points off GDP, which isn't huge by any means. But what's expected for the euro area is much more worrying. There they expect that 0.9 percentage points could be wiped off European GDP. Now in developed markets where growth isn't that large to start with, 0.9 percentage points can be a really big deal. So what kind of trade policy uncertainty are we seeing right now? Well, a timely measure of that is to listen to earnings calls from companies and see how often they mention the word tariffs, but also the word trade policy. Now you can see that in Europe, many more companies are mentioning this than they are in the US. It seems as if in the US, people are just much more calm about what's going to happen with tariffs, whereas in Europe, people are really worried. And that's justifiable because if the US is expanding its manufacturing base, then that's probably going to come at the cost of Europe, because it's going to be difficult to sell your manufactured output if the US is competing with you. Now Goldman actually says in their report, we therefore cut our 2025 euro area growth forecast on the back of US election results by 0.5 percentage points on a Q4 basis. Furthermore, they say that if the US imposes an across-the-board tariff, that 10% for everything, they'd cut it further. So certainly there's scope for a disaster in terms of economic growth in Europe if these tariffs are very broad-based. Now we saw that the effect of tariffs on Chinese exports wouldn't necessarily be catastrophic for Chinese GDP, but I think a lot of China's problems are actually domestic. So it's got a housing market where we're still seeing falling sales, we're seeing falling prices, we've seen oversupply, and that made up a huge proportion of GDP, about a quarter of GDP, if you look at indirect links for things like sectors that feed into housing. And that's always been China's quick fix, stimulate the housing market, but that's probably going to stop working because of this oversupply. And while growth in 2024 was very strong on the back of very good exports, given tariffs, that's not going to be the case in 2025. So what China's trying to do is to shift towards greater GDP growth coming from consumption. Very much a Western model. However, at the same time, it wants to carry on stimulating the supply side of its economy, subsidizing its EV manufacture, for example, or renewable energy products like solar panels. Now, the idea there is that by stimulating production, they'll have greater wages, greater corporate earnings, which in turn will increase consumption. But I think this would exacerbate the problem, which is too much production relative to consumption. It's the relative growth in those two numbers which really matters. And I don't think China can have its cake and eat it. Another policy is to give people coupons so that they can consume. So for example, in Shanghai, the municipal government allocated 500 million yuan and they handed out consumption vouchers. So those vouchers could be spent on dining, accommodation, cinema and the sports sector. But because it's a local government that has to subsidize this, these are cash strapped anyway. So I doubt this is going to shift consumption patterns in China. And just telling people to go out and consume isn't going to work either. So China faces some real problems. A mountain of debt, having to roll that debt over and always kicking the can down the road. Plus no real consumer consumption-driven economy, not yet anyway, is going to produce a headwind for them for the years ahead. So in summary then, I think the overall picture is a fairly positive one. The macroeconomic backdrop doesn't look that bad, and that looks good for things like equities globally. We do see regional divergences. So for example, the US is looking very good. Europe isn't looking very good at all. Really, it depends on what happens with the trade policies out of the Trump administration. And then in emerging markets, we're seeing this divergence between India and China. Again, something which I don't think will revert very quickly. Then if we look at inflation and the battle to beat inflation, that's pretty much won now, although we can't really declare victory until services inflation starts to fall as well. And there we'll have to have wages coming back into line with inflation. And then finally, the most unpredictable part of the outlook is to do with geopolitics. Will Russia's invasion of Ukraine spill over into a wider conflict? Could the same thing happen in the Middle East? And will that affect energy prices? And of course, the big one, will China invade Taiwan, given how ineffective sanctions have been against Russia? All of this could produce tail risk for 2025. But as I say, my expectation is that it'll be a pretty good year. Certainly in terms of economics. Now do remember, if you wanted to keep track of what's going on in economics and markets and how the two interact, you can always do that by signing up for our free weekly market roundup. You can learn more about that by going to our website, PensionCraft.com/newsletter, and you can sign up for free there. And, as always, thank you for listening.